Hey everybody, today's video is about damage uptime, and this is a concept that I've seen discussed numerous times in online discussions about Path of Exile, and I think most people have some idea as to what it means, but we're going to go into a bit more depth in today's presentation, today's video. So just to give you some background on why I even decided to make this video in the first place, I was watching some content before the start of Arch Nemesis League. It was about League starters. It's by a content creator that I very much respect, very analytical, has a great understanding of game mechanics, and they commented on a poison concoction Pathfinder having good damage uptime, kind of laying that out as a reason why it made a good League starter. Now, that statement is completely untrue, at least in any really useful sense of the word damage uptime. The damage uptime for any poison build is actually the same as a hit build. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, stick around. We're going to go into it in more detail in the damage over time section. But I just kind of wanted to throw it out there and explain my rationale for making this in the first place, in case you're wondering how I can ramble on about this for an entire video. My thought was that if somebody that has that solid of an understanding of this game and the mechanics of the game can make that mistake, then there's probably a lot of other people out there too who have a misconception. And I think there's just a bit more depth we can go into talking about this than sort of the quick definition that you see thrown around. So what is it? I think most people know that it is referring to basically how often or what proportion of the total combat time you're able to actively deal damage to an enemy. And I think to expand on that even a little bit more, it's not just about actively dealing damage, but it's actively dealing as much damage as you theoretically could be dealing. So I think that base definition that I even just expanded on a little bit does lack sufficient nuance, and we'll go into a lot more detail coming up. But the whole purpose of the concept, the reason that it even exists in the first place, is that there's an attempt to compare theoretical damage output, something that you might see in Path of Building, for example, to real-world damage output. And then it's also worth mentioning that it can apply in a marginal fashion. So essentially, I'm talking about things like buffs, where it boosts your damage and then it almost has its own separate uptime that's not necessarily completely unaffected by the need to stop attacking or casting entirely, but still, it's worth noting that damage uptime can apply differentially to sort of your like base unbuffed damage compared to sort of a theoretical max with all your buffs and everything up. And if you don't know what I mean by marginal, just a quick little analogy. So there are things called marginal tax rates. And basically, they're taxes that only apply to income earned over a certain value. So if, let's say, there was a marginal tax rate that applies once you exceed $50,000 of income, the first $50,000 you make is untaxed by that particular tax. And then let's say if you made $80,000, the next $30,000 that exceeds that threshold would be affected by that marginal tax. And so we're actually talking about something that works in the other direction here, where it's like a marginal boost to damage. But you can think of it in the other direction too, where there are sort of marginal penalties based on buff-specific uptimes and things. But that's the concept that I'm trying to get at. So these are some of the major relevant factors that I kind of identified as I was laying this out. There are other things, and we'll actually touch on a couple of things real quick at the end. But these are the main things. So the first one is the need to avoid enemy threats. This is probably the main one people think of when they're thinking of damage uptime. And this is why I say that we need to expand from here, because it's really just this thing that I think most people are considering. Secondary skills, so buffs and things, as well as something like a combo skill or even just a secondary damage skill. Damage over time, which is going to be probably the most complicated and in-depth portion of this, but a very important discussion, especially in this game where each form of damage over time is wildly different. And then coverage and containment, which is actually talking about things from the perspective of the enemy's ability to avoid or prevent your damage. So, as mentioned, avoiding threats, this tends to be what people think of when they're thinking of the concept of damage uptime. So the need to avoid threats means that you need to stop attacking and casting, which will reduce your damage output, especially if you're playing a hit build. And the thing worth noting about this is, although there can be sort of marginal impacts from this, it does have the potential to impact all of your damage output. Taken to the extreme, if you encountered an enemy where you were literally never able to stop moving for a single moment, all characters would have 0 damage uptime, right? Maybe there's some niche build out there that does damage without having to push any buttons or do anything, but aside from something weird like that I'm sure you can always find in PoE. So what are the things that factor into how avoiding threats influences damage uptime? Well, if you're tankier, that means that you don't have to avoid as many threats. You can just take the damage on your chin and keep applying new instances of damage over time, or keep hitting the enemy. So tankiness, very closely linked to this in a lot of cases. Range. So if an enemy performs a skill, there is a certain portion of the screen that you will want to avoid if it's a skill that is threatening enough to you. And having additional range just means that being constrained to a certain portion of the screen is less likely to force you to stop attacking or casting. Oftentimes people reference the poor damage uptime of melee builds, and very often that's true, especially compared to a range build of a similar type. There's passive damage, or maybe persistent damage is a better way to phrase this, but essentially any kind of damage that continues while you're dodging enemy threats. So something like totems, spell totems that are sitting there continuing to cast, minions, damage over time, stuff like that. All of that minimizes the impact of having to avoid threats, obviously. And stacking buffs are extra punished if you're forced to avoid enemy threats. A great example being the skill Bone Shatter, where every time you hit an enemy, you gain a stack that gives you a 4% more damage buff. And so if you have to stop attacking, not only do you lose damage from not attacking, but you also lose damage because that buff is going to be contributing significantly less to your damage. So you lose your bonus is, let's say you have 50% damage uptime, your bonus is cut in half, and the actual amount of time you can spend attacking is cut in half. So it more than halves your damage. Secondary skills. So these are skills that are used in combination with your main skill, either as a combo or to augment it in some way, providing some kind of buff or something like that. So the different categories being, there's temporary damage bonuses, so things like buffs to your character, like placing a totem, debuffs on the enemy, like let's say casting a curse or a mark on them. All of these things enhance the damage of your primary skill, or if you use more than one skill, your primary skills. And they are subject to marginal uptime, right? A curse might only be up 60% of the time, or a totem might only be up 40% of the time that's giving you a buff. In some cases, it might be virtually 100%, though. There are temporary defensive bonuses. This just feeds into the idea on the last slide of being tankier, allowing you to just tank hits instead of avoiding them, improving your damage uptime. And there are a lot of good defensive steroids in this game that allow you to tank some really big hits. So things like guard skills or banner actives, things like that. So those can boost your damage uptime significantly if used correctly. There's secondary damage skills. So either things like combo skills, which don't apply here as much, but I just thought were worth mentioning. But in general, when I say secondary skills, I'm talking about things that allow you to actively deal damage while some other form of persistent damage is ticking away, right? Like you ignite an enemy, and while they're ignited, you use Flame Surge to fill in what would otherwise be time that is. You do technically boost your damage by getting multiple applications of Ignite, but there is a limited return on that, which we'll cover in the damage over time section. And so some of that time is better spent doing something like debuffing the enemy, or in the case I'm talking about here, using some other active skill that deals damage, like Flame Surge. Another example would be, let's say, using a skill like Discharge that has a cooldown, and then having some other skill that you can use while that skill is on cooldown. Similarly, you could have multiple persistent skills going at the same time. So, for example, summoners often have more than one type of summon, and they are able to both deal damage at the same time and contribute to the total damage. The last good example I'll give is, let's say, a melee character who uses an ancestor totem. They're wailing away on the enemy at the same time their totem is, so they had to invest the time to cast the totem, but now it's augmenting their primary skill's damage as well as hitting them and dealing its own damage. So, all these types of skills are able to prevent wasted time. So if it is time you are forced to, avoid an enemy, and let's say you can't get in range as a melee character, but you're at range, you can cast some of these skills. So it allows you to take time that would otherwise be wasted from a damage output perspective and put it toward mitigating that penalty to your damage output. And you do tend to be rewarded for skilled usage here, right? If you use a defensive steroid on a skill that you could have tanked anyway, then that's not very effective. It's better if you preserve it for a really powerful skill that you couldn't tank without that temporary bonus, but you can tank with it. Think of something like a Shaper Slam. So as well, there are similar kinds of skilled usages for temporary damage bonuses. So a great example would be the Focus skill. So if, let's say, you have a Focus mod that gives you, 30% attack speed while you're focused, well, that only lasts for 4 seconds, and then it's on an 8-second cooldown. So if you use it in a situation where you can only attack for 2 of those 4 seconds, then it's kind of like it only lasts 2 seconds and has a 10-second cooldown. So you're much better off waiting an extra second, potentially, if it's off cooldown, if that allows you to hit them for the entire 4 seconds of the duration of that buff. Okay, so damage over time. This is the most, like I said, kind of complicated or in-depth section of this presentation, but it's important because damage over time in PoE is widely variable. So the different characteristics or properties of damage over time. You have a stack count, so you have up to an infinite stack count with poison, as low as a single stack count with bleed or ignite, not factoring in Crimson Dance in this case. So the basic concept with damage uptime and stack count is that fewer stacks means better uptime, more stacks means worse uptime. However, more stacks does boost your damage ceiling in total, because effectively what you get by applying another stack of damage over time to the enemy is, if you have, let's say there's a situation where you can only apply one active stack of damage to the enemy, like Ignite, then igniting them again, the only thing it does is boost the average Ignite for the duration that they overlap. Because if you have 2 stacks of Ignite on an enemy, only the higher damage one is active at any given time. So basically, with 2 applications, it's like you get a lucky damage roll. But if instead, let's say you were able to apply a second stack, like if you use the Ember Wake unique ring, then you actually just deal twice as much damage. So although fewer stacks means better uptime, it also means worse scaling with attack and cast speed. Also, it's worth noting that at infinite stacks, uptime is equivalent to hit skills. So this goes back to the example I gave at the very beginning where I said poison builds don't have better uptime than hit skills, because any time that you miss the ability to apply another stack of poison, you lose all the damage that it would have applied. Whereas, like I mentioned with Ignite, if you miss an opportunity to apply a stack of Ignite, you're only missing out on whatever the difference in damage is between the higher stack and the lower damage stack. Potentially. You might not even, but on average you do. So it basically poison or any build that has sort of a functionally infinite number of stacks, like a stacks that you'll never max out on, it's basically just a delayed hit build. You can kind of think of it that way, with some other important distinctions like duration being a true modifier for damage and stuff like that. Then there's stack duration. So longer duration on the stack means better damage uptime. That kind of makes sense intuitively, and shorter duration is worse uptime. Again, though, this assumes a functionally limited count. If you have an infinite stack count, then the concept of damage uptime, again, shifts to being the same as with hit skills. So with infinite stacks or functionally infinite stacks, duration is actually a true Moore multiplier, right? There's a longer ramping up time, but if you double the duration of a poison stack, then it just deals twice as much damage. And because you're never overwriting those or sort of superseding any of those poison stacks, and they always deal their full damage, assuming the enemy doesn't die before it finishes, it is a true Moore multiplier. Double the duration, it deals double the damage. And then you have the roll range. So anytime you attack or cast, right, there's a roll that takes place. Let's say your skill might deal between 1 and 2,000 damage, or whatever it may be. A larger range means worse uptime, and a shorter range means better uptime. You can take this to the extreme and say, well, if there was no damage range, if you just always deal, let's say, 1,500 a hit instead of rolling between 1 and 2,000, then what that means is that anytime you apply a damage over time effect based on that roll, all you need to do is make sure you apply it again before that stack runs out, and you'll always be dealing maximum damage, right? There's no worry about having a good roll of that type of damage over time applied to them. Again, at infinite stacks, things change. There is no effect on damage uptime, because you don't have this situation where one stack is like overwriting or superseding another stack. And so whatever the roll range is, you're always just dealing the average of that over, a long period of time. So all of this really has to do with the fact that when you're limited on stacks and you get multiple applications of the same type of damage over time, then you're boosting the average. Again, it's like getting a lucky roll, but if you can get more than one lucky roll, you could get sort of double lucky or triple lucky, etc. So let's look at the implications numbers wise for damage. So this is just a theoretical maximum you can ever get in terms of a damage boost by getting multiple damage applications. So again, I'm just using Ignite as an example. So let's say your damage range is between 0 and 1,000. And we're just saying 0 right now so I can illustrate the hypothetical maximum this can ever be. But if we say your damage roll range is between 0 and 1,000, that means the average is 500, right? So the most you can ever boost that average is doubling it. You can never make it so that the average is higher than the high end of the roll range. That doesn't make any sense. So this graph is kind of showing you how close you get to that theoretical maximum multiplier of doubling your average damage with the number of applications, right? So this is one application. You can see here at 5 applications, now we're probably it's like 65% more damage or something. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head. At 10 applications, now you're looking at more like 80% more damage, etc., etc. And this will approach, but actually never truly hit 2 for the multiplier. Asymptotically approaches that value. So this is just to showcase the theoretical maximum you could ever get. But now let's look at like real world scenarios. So just to be clear here, this damage spread on the x-axis here, what this is describing is how many times larger the top end of the range is compared to the bottom end. So for example, if you deal between 1 and 500 damage, the damage spread would be 5 down here because 500 is 5 times 100. Right? The top end is 5 times larger than the lower end. So with this damage spread, you can see that having a larger damage spread means that the impact of getting additional rolls is greater. The other thing that you can see is that each of these lines represents a certain number of trials. Obviously, getting additional rolls has more, has an impact, but that impact diminishes with more and more rolls, right? So there's kind of a sweet spot where getting a damage spread that is too extreme has diminishing returns, but there is some value in getting additional spread with respect to damage uptime. And additional trials do boost your damage uptime or your average damage. But, there's diminishing returns here as well. So just as sort of a simple, fairly real-world scenario, you can see that if you get, let's say, something like 2 damage applications on, with a damage spread of 5, it's giving you more than 20% more damage on average, which is pretty substantial. So that extra recast is a pretty nice boost, right? If that recast were a curse instead, getting, an extra 20-some% more damage would be really, really great. And so similarly with a 5 damage spread, if you can get a third attempt, now you're dealing something like, you get another, let's say, 10% boost over this value to this value. But then it starts to taper off pretty substantially. So the point is that getting a couple of additional applications of damage over time when your stacks are limited is pretty useful. But beyond that, it's not that useful. And if you have a fairly tight damage spread, it's also less useful. It might be, again, let's use Ignite as an example. If you're playing an Ignite build, it might not be worth reapplying, over using something like Flame Surge instead. Whereas maybe if you're doing an Ignite build that uses lightning damage and the damage spread is really big, then maybe it's actually not nearly as worth it to use something like Flame Surge because you're better to focus on getting multiple applications of damage to get the highest roll possible. So then coverage and containment. This is looking at the enemy's ability to avoid damage from you. Anybody who has encountered this boss probably knows what I have pictured here. This is the boss of the Wakawairu Taihu map, or however you say it, the unique map. Maybe the most annoying boss in the entire game. Essentially, has a proximity shield, leaves trails of cold ground, moves really fast. So it's just hard to deal any damage to this character. Incredibly obnoxious, right? So this is just an extreme example of the idea of coverage and containment on enemies. So mobile enemies can reduce your damage uptime, right? They become harder to hit, or if your skills rely on some type of ground effect, like let's say Toxic Rain, then they're just more likely to sort of move out of the threatening area. One of the best things you can do is limit enemy safe space. So basically, it says rage, it should say range, but increasing your coverage or range. So something like increased area of effect, or extra projectiles that kind of make a wider cone when you're shooting your projectile skill or whatever. Those types of things will make it less likely that the enemy avoids your damage. And then, of course, there's things that hinder enemy movement. So crowd control effects, can you stun them? Can you slow them? Etc. Literally hinder would be an effect that works in this case. And so all of those things make it less likely that the enemy is able to avoid your damage output. And then just a couple of other things that I thought were worth mentioning. Context, so the type of content you're doing, essentially, or the specific situation you're in. So are you doing just general mapping? Is that mapping super juiced? Are you fighting a particular kind of boss? So, it's very different if you're fighting, let's say, at Ziri versus Shaper. The kind of defenses you need to be able to tank their abilities, and also the types of character attributes to maximize your damage output. So just as an example, and this next bullet point here, mobility, feeds into this. For Shaper, if you want to farm Shaper, having high movement speed is really, really important, because you spend a lot of time walking around or traveling against Shaper. You have those 4 mini bosses you have to kill at the beginning, and then additionally, in between each phase, which is unavoidable with Shaper, you have to traverse that area to get back to the Shaper arena. And so mobility actually has a massive impact on damage uptime. Most people think of it just sort of while you're actively in combat, but if you think of it at a more macro level, still the time for you to finish a Shaper run will be reduced substantially by movement speed. Whereas, that's not nearly true to the same degree if you're fighting, let's say, Maven, where it's a fairly contained arena. Yeah, being able to move is useful, but it's not going to be nearly as useful as it is against somebody like the Shaper. Modifiers, so if you have anything that, let's say, map modifiers, or like some of the special modifiers potentially with the Atlas Keystone passives that are coming out soon, these kinds of things can influence damage uptime by just making you, less tanky, or reducing your recovery or something like that. And then there's recovery methods. So you can have a situation where it's not safe to engage the enemy because your life total is not high enough, and so you can be forced to have worse damage uptime by having recovery methods that are difficult to sort of activate against an enemy. Like if you're really reliant on flasks, but you keep running out of flasks and have to portal out of the fight, for example, that can be really punishing to damage uptime. Or something like being very reliant on leech, but then having to avoid enemy threats a lot of the times. If you mess up and then take a big chunk of damage, then it's a lot riskier when you have to like re-engage them to start leeching again. So just stuff like that, how your recovery methods interact with the particular fight you're in. And then there's mobility, and I just kind of gave that big example of Shaper, but basically, depending on the type of content you're doing, mobility can be really, really important. Mobility is really important in mapping, again, for specific boss fights. Ziri is another one where mobility is really important because you have to traverse the temple and you have all those mini boss fights leading up to her, etc. But also the ability to disengage or re-engage with an enemy in combat is really important because it reduces uptime. If, let's say, you're a melee character, you have to jump out of some area type damage. Ziri throws down her double flame blast. You get out of the way. You're not able to deal damage while you're avoiding that. And then the quicker you can jump back in and start hitting again, the better your damage uptime. So really, really useful to make sure that avoiding threats is less punitive for your character. And so that's it. That's my discussion on damage uptime. Some of it you might question, is this really damage uptime? Maybe sometimes I blurred the lines here a little bit with what I'm discussing, but I think all of it kind of feeds into the same purpose, which is really trying to quantify real world damage output. So things that are hard to represent in path of building, but do have a really strong impact on your build. And again, that's even true for buffs and things. I know you can tick buffs in path of building, but if a buff only has some uptime, then how do you represent that in path of building? It gets a little bit trickier. So whether or not you want to fight me on the semantics of this, hopefully it proves useful in just helping you understand real world damage output so you don't get in one of those situations where this build, you plan it out in POB, it looks great on paper, and then in practice it plays like ass because the character is not tanky enough and piling on enough buffs is just not realistic. It eats away at your ability to use your main skill too much and all that kind of stuff. And so the real world damage output ends up being a fraction of what it says in Path of Building. Anyway, so we'll leave it at that. Best of luck to everybody in Sentinel League, and I'll see you in the next video.